Welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week I'm joined by my colleague, Simone Rizkallah, to discuss how Christians can hold intention support for both the modern state of Israel and Armenia. The Philos Project and our sister organization, Save Armenia, have been educating and discussing the persecution of ancient Armenian Christians in Artsakh by Azerbaijan for the better half of a year. Back in December of 2020, Azerbaijan essentially blockaded Armenian Christians in Artsakh, which was the start of an ethnic cleansing of over 120,000 ethnically Armenian Christians. Recently, Armenia has come up in the news for two reasons. First, Armenia recognized an independent Palestinian state. And second, Armenia came up in the heated debate and conversation between Piers Morgan and Candace Owens, where they discussed topics such as Israel, genocide in Gaza. And last week on the Philos Project podcast, we discussed Candace Owens and her Jewish conspiracy here in the West and why she doesn't support Israel. In that same interview with Piers Morgan, Candace Owens used Armenia as an example for why Christians can't support the modern state of Israel. How can Christians support Israel who supply arms to Azerbaijan, which end up persecuting Armenian Christians in Artsakh? This is a complicated question. It's one that requires a lot of nuance, and there's no one better to discuss that than Simone, who's an Egyptian-Armenian Catholic. This conversation is insightful. Again, it highlights the great nuances of this complex, both historic, religious, and geopolitical context in the region today. And I hope you enjoy the conversation. Simone, welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm so excited to have you. You're here on staff with the Philos Project. You also have your own podcast, Beyond Rome, which I'd love for you to connect the viewer to at the end of the podcast. But first and foremost, you are a Catholic Egyptian-Armenian woman. And so you are the perfect authority to speak to this issue that's become salient in the news. Armenia recognized Palestine as an independent state. So that was at the top of geopolitical news. But even more than that, in this cultural conversation, Candace Owens has talked about Armenia and the lack of international attention on Armenia, which is important to bring attention to. But for her, it seems to be part of an argument as to why Christians shouldn't support Israel. And so today we're going to tackle the extremely complex and nuanced conversation of how we as Christians, Protestants and Catholics, can hold intention support for both Israel and the Jewish people and for Christian Armenians being persecuted by Azerbaijan. So that's a heavy introduction, but I would love for you to tell the audience about your family and your connection to Armenia, and also really the story of your great-grandmother, who is the matriarch of your family.
Oh, thank you so much, Dominique. It's an honor and a privilege to be on the Philos Project podcast with you. I love this podcast. And yes, this is quite a topic and very, as you mentioned, very timely. So yes, I am Egyptian, Armenian, American, and also a Catholic. My family is Egyptian because of the Armenian Genocide. So my great-grandparents left what is Mardin, basically, and Dikranagerd. Now these are both considered part of Turkey, but it's ancient Armenia, to Egypt, because Egypt at the time was an open society and Armenians could find safe haven there. And so my grandparents and my parents were born and raised in Egypt. I'm actually going to Armenia in a couple weeks, which I'm so excited about, because I'll be the first person in my direct line to be in our ancient homeland since my great-grandparents fled before the Armenian Genocide. So I'm gonna rediscover my Armenian soul when I'm there, and I cannot believe it. And my grandmother, who is really the one who transmitted Armenian faith and culture to me, will be so happy that I was able to make it to Armenia. And you mentioned, her experiences as an Armenian in Cairo. I wrote this in an article, and so as our senior research fellow, Andrew Dorn. But when Egypt and Israel went to war with one another, that day, the first day of the war, a Muslim grocer told my grandmother, not my great-grandmother, my grandmother.
I'm sorry, I got that wrong. So it's even closer to your direct story. So it's within living memory.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, my grandmother lived to be, this is how tough Armenian women are, to be 104 years old, 1 month shy of her 104th birthday. She saw the Hindenburg fly over Cairo.
Wow.
Very, very interesting life. And he said to her, first we'll get them, meaning the Jews, and then we'll go, and then it's you, meaning the Christians. Today the Jews, tomorrow you. That's not a story that I read. It's not a story in a book. It's a story my grandmother told us. So for me, Israel and Armenia, these two countries, they're actually natural friends and allies, not enemies.
Yeah, they're these two, for the most part, ethnically homogenous, ancient people in their ancestral homelands, both trying to survive and exist in a very hostile neighborhood and environment. And so their stories are very similar, which I'd love to have you expand upon after we talk a little bit about the conflict. So what is going on? So why is Armenia in, the modern news, or maybe lack thereof, but why should Armenia be more in the news?
Yes. Well, I certainly wished that Armenia were more in the news in 2023, because in September of 2023, this Armenian region called Artsakh in Armenian, also more popularly known as the Nagorno-Karabakh, where 120,000 Armenians were living and where Armenians have resided for literally centuries, since before Armenians were Christians. And Armenia is the first Christian nation to declare itself Christian, 301 AD. So we have spiritual significance for all Christians being the first Christian nation. And again, it was the apostles, St. Jude Thaddeus and St. Bartholomew, that evangelized Armenia. And then later, St. Gregory, the Illuminator, is the man who eventually led to Armenia being a Christian nation, not just making it legal for Christians, but official for Christians. That's a beautiful historical point. But Armenia itself is trying to survive. And it has always been under threat through historically. So I wish the media, I wish Christians, I wish the West, I wish everyone had paid more attention in 2023, because what happened was this little region was religiously and ethnically cleansed by September of 2023 after 10 months of being blockaded. So being starved to death and being violently assaulted. And you can, if you're interested, you can read about what happened in 2023. But it was horrific, and the media was completely apathetic. And just as mainstream media was starting to pick up more news about what was happening in Armenia, then Hamas attacked Israel, and we were definitely not going to be paid attention to in the news.
And they're being persecuted by Azerbaijan. Could you talk a little bit about them as kind of the antagonist in this conflict?
Yes, Azerbaijan. So Artsakh, long story short, after the Soviets fell, Artsakh became its own kind of independent jurisdiction, technically under Azerbaijan. It's very weird and complicated. But it is Armenian. And Azerbaijan has wanted that land. And so it took a great opportunity starting in December of 2022 to cut off a road, the Lashin corridor, and basically prevent food, medical supplies, and anything from getting into that region. Once they had weakened the population, then they attacked in September. And then in one day, Artsakhians surrendered. And so now it is empty of Armenians. 120,000 Armenians are gone from where they've lived since, I think, the 7th century BC.
And this is kind of a modern development could you characterize this as almost an ancient push and pull in a conflict? Or is Azerbaijan Muslim?
Yes.
So it's in this kind of ancient conflict.
Azerbaijan and Turkey have publicly said that they are one nation, two states. Turkey were the genocidal perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. They have again said out loud, we're going to finish what our fathers started. And they don't just mean Artsakh, this region, they mean all of Armenia, because Armenia is that one little Christian nation of 3 million people that's in between Azerbaijan and Turkey. And Azeris and Turks they're ethnically Turks. They consider themselves the same people. And that little Christian nation of Armenians is the only thing kind of getting in the way from this massive pan-Turkic region. So everything that I'm sharing with you right now, Dominique, is something that they themselves have said and stated out loud. And in 2005, the mayor of Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, said to a German audience, what you did to the Jews, we wish to do to the Armenians. You can understand what it is we're trying to do. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has said, we're going to finish what our fathers started. So it's not like this is a big secret, kind of the way like terrorists like post on YouTube, like exactly what they want. I mean, they're saying they're terrorists. They're saying exactly what they want. They want to finish what their fathers started in the 20th century when 1.5 million Armenians were massacred during the First World War. So Artsakh was the first step. After they took Artsakh, which I still cannot believe happened, because again, this is centuries, and watching Christian churches and monuments being desecrated, being destroyed. After that, they shamelessly went after 4 Armenian villages, which Armenia surrendered and gave up, and they will not stop until they have succeeded in taking all of Armenia.
So their aims are very similar. Not that these conflicts should be compared, directly, but comparatively, Hamas has similar aims. Territorial conquest comes with expelling a religious adversary or an ethnic group tied to the land.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It is very paralleled, which is why Jews and Armenians are natural friends, not enemies.
Well, I want to get your take on Candace Owens, which we did a podcast last week on Candace Owens. But one thing I've seen emerge kind of in her argument as to why Christians shouldn't support Israel is because Israel and Azerbaijan, who are security allies in the region, Israel supplies military weapons to Azerbaijan, which is then used in the conflict. And therefore, as Christians, we shouldn't support Israel in their war against Hamas. And we can talk a little bit more about it, but it appears Candace is also tying this link of, the Jewish conspiracy here in the West is only focusing on Israel, and it tries to undermine why Republicans and conservatives should support Israel. So I'll play 2 parts from the same clip on the Piers Morgan show.
Jewish people die in Israel, it's wall-to-wall coverage. But when Christians die all over the world, nobody talks about it. Everyone wants to correlate everything to World War II. Everyone wants to talk about Adolf Hitler, and rightfully so, he was a horrific.
And then this is the second part of that same clip.
All around the world. And it is especially horrific while at the exact same time that it is happening, the slaughter of Christians in Armenia, the arms being supplied by Israel, that the media turns the other way and says, oh, okay, but what about Israel? What about what's happening in Israel?
So I want to acknowledge, and I think we both probably feel the same way, but I don't want to speak for you, so you can correct me if I'm wrong in this summary. But I do agree with Candace in that the media hasn't covered what's happening in Armenia because it undermines maybe a political agenda. They're Christians. Christians have been persecuted across the Middle East with very little coverage. So their story is one similar to that of Christians, again, across the Middle East during decolonization. There's been an ethnic cleansing. So Candace is right to point that out. I think where maybe both of us would disagree with her is that therefore we shouldn't support Israel. So do you have any initial kind of reactions or thoughts to Candace?
Yeah. I mean, I'm so glad that she's using her platform to put the word Armenia, which is an unknown, it was once a very known country situation in American history. Incredible. So I'm glad that she's saying something about Armenia and bringing that attention to the minds of Americans. But since when have Americans and Westerners and Christians in modern, like recent history, cared about Armenian or Christian persecution, period? Not just Westerners, but Christians. What about the churches? How many churches care about the first Christian nation, Armenia, or even have heard about Armenia or know about Armenia's history, even though Armenia is mentioned 4 times in the Bible, Mount Ararat, Noah's Ark? That historical memory has been lost. So when she's pointing that out, yeah, but number one, where were you? Where was anybody when Armenian Christians were starving to death in 2023? I mean, literally starving to death. Not just Armenians, like she pointed out, many, I mean, she's right. Christians are the number 1 persecuted people in the world. 1 out of 7 Christians is persecuted. I mean, go look at the map that Open Doors has put up and see, gosh, Christians are not in a good situation when it comes to persecuted church. But as a Catholic, I have always been in my entire life disappointed that the church has paid so little attention to persecuted Christians, especially because as Christians, as Catholics, we consider everyone a Christian as part of the body of Christ. So where was that? And where was it when it really mattered, which is last year? Why you have to create polarization and division with Israel, I think is unnecessary. Bring attention to Armenia and bring attention to the Christians. You don't need to become an enemy of Israel to do so, which again, she kind of does what she says. We all know, well, the media pays attention when Jews are being killed, but she's only paying attention to Armenia insofar as it becomes, as it's a quote unquote enemy of Israel. So she's kind of doing the same exact thing that she's saying that the media is doing. She only started to care about Armenia when Israel became a problem. Where was she and everybody else before?
Yeah, where was she on October 6th talking about Armenia?
Yeah.
I think that's a great and a very astute question. I think, but also what she's pointing to is the very complicated relationship between Armenia and Israel, because they are not strategic allies in the region, and it comes with a larger geopolitical understanding. And I want to read a little excerpt from Dan Hare's article. Dan Hare used to work at the Philos Project. Now he is a Christian working at Save Armenia. So he's a great authority to speak to this. And he talks about that complicated relationship. So I just want to quote a piece of his article that I will link below, and I really encourage everyone to read. He writes, in all fairness, Armenia does have its qualms with Israel. First, it feels betrayed by the fact that Azerbaijan imports nearly 70% of its weapons from Israel, which Candace does talk about. These weapons are routinely used against Armenians, including in the ethnic cleansing of 120,000 Armenian Christians from Artsakh. Additionally, while Armenians recognize and mourn the Holocaust, Israel does not recognize the Armenian Genocide, and that's because of their strategic alliance with Turkey. While these matters amount to frustration, Armenians also understand that Israelis are not inherently anti-Armenian, and that, like Armenians, they are trying to survive in a highly hostile neighborhood. While Armenians are preoccupied with fending off attacks from Azerbaijan, Israel is preoccupied with confronting the Iranian threat. The Iranian threat is the pretext for the entire Israeli-Azerbaijani relationship. Azerbaijan's proximity to Iran has made it an essential base for operations for Israeli intelligence operating against Tehran. And Dan says very beautifully, to be clear, Azerbaijan's relationship with Israel is a matter of geopolitical calculation and not one of religious pluralism. And so just to kind of summarize what Dan is painting here is there's an Armenian, Russian, Iran strategic partnership. And then on the other side of that, there's an Israeli, Turkish, Azerbaijan strategic partnership. And so I think what Candace's statement also fails to understand is the nuances of the geopolitical dynamic in the region. And as Dan points out, these are two small ethnic religious communities trying to fight for their ancestral homelands. And so unfortunately, they've had to pick strategic sides that don't align with each other. I don't know if you have anything else to add to what Dan said in his article.
Yeah, that's an excellent article. Everybody should go read Dan's article. And just so everyone knows, Save Armenia was, incubated at the Philos Project. Mm-hmm. So to me, this is historical proof that Jews and Armenians are natural allies in the fact that, the Philos Project incubated Save Armenia. It was not one or the other. It was both and in terms of Jews and Christians and Jews and Armenian Christians. So that's something. The reason I was able to do Armenian advocacy in 2023 was because of the Philos Project. That's a fact and a great privilege for my people. But also, again, something Westerners don't understand because they don't have the experience. But for me, as an Armenian, having Jewish friends, we understand each other. We have generational trauma from genocide. We have the survival gene. We have to survive. So we understand each other. Politicians, governments, nuances of geopolitics. Yes, sure, all of that. But in a very human experience, we understand each other because we have to survive in very hostile and often the same enemy, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to, that's real. So for my Jewish friends, we get each other. We get each other as Easterners living in the West. We get each other, and we understand that we have to look beyond playing mere politics, because at the root of it, we have faith and values in common. Armenia and Israel are, again, natural friends. These are both Western thinking, Western values, Judeo-Christian alliance, democracies, all these things. We have that in common. If on the political realm we have to make friends with people we are not actually friends with, that's
newsflash. Israel and Turkey are not besties. They don't have the same vision for the region.
Turkey, who considers themselves, one nation, two states with Azerbaijan, is pro-Hamas, but Azerbaijan is somehow friends with Israel. Like, sure. I mean, Israel sells arms to Azerbaijan because it's to their benefit to survive. Should they stop? Absolutely. Should Israel recognize the Armenian Genocide? Absolutely. And I'm in communication with Jews and Israelis all the time about that. Jews and Israelis say that. Yes, it is time. This was just in the Jerusalem Post. It is time for Israel to recognize the Armenian Genocide. It is time for them to stop selling arms to Israel, sure. But again, I leave that not to us, but to politicians who understand that that's their responsibility in their vocations as politicians and as journalists and in their callings to make that happen. Listen, and Candace knows better, and she should know this. If America cared about Armenia, it would put pressure on Azerbaijan, and stop supporting Azerbaijan, by the way. It would put pressure on Azerbaijan to encourage Israel, as Dan mentioned in his article, to stop selling arms to kill Armenians in Armenia. So how is it that we are so hard on Israel and say we're not going to support Israel when we are so lenient with America, when America should be doing the same thing? Do I think that, do I support America? Of course, the country I was born in. Am I going to be criticize America for not supporting Armenia? Yes. So we have to ask for all of it, especially as Christians. We can't, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It certainly ought not to be for the American Christian. It has to be both.
I think you're hitting on something that's really important, which a faction of the right here in America is kind of diverging from, which is an understanding for complex nuances. I think Candace is trying to fit this into a Jewish overall conspiracy. As I mentioned, if you're curious, you can watch the last episode I did on that. And that the media is just not talking about Armenia because of this Jewish conspiracy. And she puts it in this Jewish versus Christian binary, which she seems to really view geopolitics in the region and then also domestic politics here in the United States. But as you pointed out, and as the Egyptian man told your grandmothers, first the Jews, then you, they share a common enemy. And we actually, as Christians here in the West, should be the natural supporters of both the Jewish people and of the Armenians. And I was wondering, could you maybe talk even from a personal position on, how do you hold intention support for those two things, being Armenian and supporting Israel?
Yeah, well, in my free time, I'm part of the Jewish Armenian Friendship Council with Save Armenia, that meets with Armenians and Jews and Israelis who are able to think beyond. Listen, it's in the political realm, but it's not making an idol of politics, in the sense that to see things beyond our political ideologies and categories. So that's the first thing. And that's why I love, again, the word philos, friendship, right? That we're dealing with real people with real lives that, like you noted, Dominique, it's very complicated. Is there a better way? Is there a way through friendship and through culture and through bridge building and through real dialogue that we can start to influence culture in such a way that, yes, Israel is going to stop selling arms to Azerbaijan, recognize the Armenian Genocide, but why would we not support our Jewish allies and friends in that aim? How can you ask someone in friendship to make those decisions without first being supportive of supporting them as well, which is in our best interest as well? So I don't see how shooting one foot saves the other foot, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered your question as clearly as you were.
No, you did.
For it.
No, that was beautiful. And I think, and speaking from both of us are, more conservative leaning American Christian women. And so I think for us to be able to look internally towards the conversation that's happening here in America is really important, to not just ignore some of the conversations and dialogue coming out of the conservative right and some leaders on the conservative right. There's something else I really wanted to touch on because it seems to be an emerging argument beyond Candace Owens, and Tucker Carlson exemplified this in his interview with Mother Isaac, where he asked, where are the Christians? And using, as you pointed out, where was Candace Owens talking about Armenia on October 6th? So using Christians also for their own political aims. I really want to push back against Christians here in the US only talking about Christians in the East when it fits their political narrative. And so for those who didn't see what Tucker said in that interview, this is just provides a little bit of context. We're not going to talk about the material he speaks of, but just for the audience's sake.
How are the Christians doing in that region, in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Israel proper? We almost never hear from them.
Okay, so it was really, really brief, but basically he's making an argument against Israel because there's Christians in Gaza and the West Bank. He doesn't address the Christians who are flourishing in the state of Israel. But Simone, as an Egyptian, can you talk about also how Christians have been treated across the Middle East? We kind of talked about that, but I think it's so disingenuous to look at the West Bank and Gaza, which are governed by the PA and Hamas respectively, and try and extrapolate how Israel feels about Christians when really across the Middle East, there has been an ethnic cleansing. So looking beyond Israel and Armenia, what has been the Christian experience in these majority Muslim countries?
I mean, not good. Even Muslims don't want to live in certain Arab countries, they so not PC, but it's true. I mean, now 250 million, 300 million Christians that are persecuted by Islamists. I mean, it's when Candace and Tucker talk about the Jewish conspiracy and what about Christians in the West Bank, and how come no one is talking about these Islamic governments that are treating women and children and Christians and other minority religions so atrociously? Why do we have this brain fog or blind spot to all these other Arab nations?
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. I will not understand. So it's not that Christians in the West Bank and Gaza aren't suffering. Of course they are. But why are we not blaming or pointing to their own governments that are doing that to them? Why is Israel always the problem?
Mm-hmm. The Islamists.
Islamists. Why is Israel always the problem when there are Christians that live in Israel? There are other minority religions that live in Israel, and there's a preference to be there. And why? And this is my call out to the church. Why do we not tell those stories of Christians and Arab Christians in Israel, or the Druze or the Maronite communities? And why do we not actually tell those stories? Why are we only telling stories of Christians in Gaza, but not Christians in Israel who are fighting in the IDF? And there's so many. You can draw your own political conclusions, but why do we censor and not tell stories from so many different perspectives, which might really shock people? And I think I expect that from, sadly, journalism has become propaganda and media has become propaganda. Okay, I get that. Sad, but true. My call out is to the church herself, who should be the place of being able to hold things in tension and being able to hold different stories that sometimes don't present such simplistic narratives and answers. Shouldn't the church be the first place for those stories to get out?
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And we have Christians working for us here at the Philos Project, like Naveen.
Yep.
And, why isn't Candace interested in her story? Why isn't the political right or the journalistic right here in the United States interested in that story? And kind of speaking more personally, I expect that from maybe the more radical left that isn't religious, that rejects religion, but from the conservative right that claims to be, I know Candace Owens just pronounced her faith in, she's been born again into Catholicism or has converted to Catholicism. Tucker Carlson is a self-professing Protestant Christian. And I expect more nuance from them. And that's why I think
Yes.
calling that narrative out is really important, because they are Christians. And so they shouldn't turn a blind eye to the Christians that don't fit that narrative. And next week, we'll be talking with Andrew Doran about Christians in Lebanon. So why aren't they talking about the Christians suffering under Hezbollah in Lebanon? Because it doesn't fit that narrative with Hamas. Yeah.
Exactly. Sorry to interrupt you, Dominique. You're
No.
kind of fired up. And she's a new Catholic, and she's been in the political sphere for so long. It's very hard to untangle yourself from seeing everything through your political eyes. But now, as a Christian, as a Catholic, you must see things with a different set of eyes, with spiritual eyes. And that will be more demanding. That will be much more demanding on every level. And I would encourage her to read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, especially as a Catholic, on Jewish-Catholic relations. I would encourage her to study John Paul II, his trip to Israel in 2000. If she's listening to this podcast, give me a call. But she, this is, it's not the right way. And it's, again, you can only serve one God, Scripture says. And if politics is your God, if that's your driving force, if that's how you're seeing everything, it's very difficult to be loyal to the spirit of truth.
That's a beautiful call to action. I'm almost tempted to leave it there because I'm like, what a beautiful way to end this conversation. But I think one of the last things I wanted to hear from you just personally is, as we've talked about, as an Armenian, Egyptian, Catholic woman, what has your relationship with Jews been like? I know you touched on that a little bit, but what has your experience in Israel been? I know you have a lot of Jewish friends, both here at the Philos Project personally, and I know your father is also really imparted to you the importance of Jewish-Christian relationships. So taking it down to the most personal, the smallest level possible, how has that blessed you in your life, in your faith?
Yeah, I think I took it for granted that everybody had Jewish friends, and I realized maybe that's not true for Christians. But I have always had close Jewish friends, and again, that bond of historical parallels, and also the Jews in Los Angeles, where I grew up, always knew about the Armenian Genocide, and even the Museum of Tolerance in LA had a little Armenian Genocide corner. So I always felt this affinity that because we had such similar histories, that they got me. They understood where I was coming from. But my dad, his best friend in Cairo, which he didn't realize till later, is a Sephardic Jew, and they had to keep that hidden. And then Israel was the only place his best friend's family could go because the persecution of Jews was so high. And so my parents lived sadly, like in very typical Middle Eastern context with a lot of anti-Semitism, but they themselves were not anti-Semitic. And their influence, again, we never really talked about anti-Semitism because it was such a non-reality in my home. It was just so tangibly philo-Semitic that we didn't even think about it. The way that Americans are obsessed with community because we don't have community, because we're like struggling with the epidemic of loneliness, and other countries, like, we don't talk about community because we just have it. That's how it was in my home when it came to our Jewish brothers and sisters. Only now with all these current events, so I go, wow, that was a really like privileged spiritual upbringing that it wouldn't even really, it wasn't like, hey, don't be anti-Semitic. It was just, we just were so philo-Semitic and didn't even know what that word meant growing up.
I love that.
So that's
so beautiful.
Yeah. So I don't know if that was exactly the question that you were asking, but a deep, deep love and affinity, and that is my wish for the church and for the world, that for Christians especially, like, our Messiah is Jewish and our faith is Jewish, and that's a fact. It's a historical fact, spiritual fact, and something we should definitely lean into, especially now.
I agree. I think I've become a better Christian understanding the Hebraic roots of my faith. And that, is a tagline for the Philos Project, is Christians understanding the Hebraic roots of their spiritual homeland. But it's so true. It's a part of our story. It's the first part of our story. And as you said, Jesus was Jewish. And so understanding even the New Testament through that lens has been so powerful. And just kind of breaking it down to the most, like, the localized, the most personal level, is, as Christians in this space, speaking out against anti-Semitism is so important. If you strip away the politics of it, who's in power, where money is going, if there's a current war, I think our call as Christians is to speak out against that. And I really just want to hone it home to the end of your article, which is, it's first the Jews and then you, then the Christians. We have a dog in this fight, really. And there is a culture war against Judeo-Christian values here in the West, and understanding that, Armenia and Israel, they have a shared enemy. You have these Islamist ideologies that have a very different vision for your future, for my future, as Christians, and also for our Jewish brothers and sisters. And that's a very real reality. And it's one that I hope commentators on the conservative right start to understand, especially in nuance. I think it's been a beautiful conversation. We can point out, how Israel has gone wrong. We're not apologists for Israel. It's not that they don't do anything wrong. I think there is room for internal dialogue, for critique. And in that nuance, there's a lot of love and the ability to reach across the aisle to our Jewish brothers and sisters. Yes. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Simone, for coming on. And you did talk about, understanding, those Hebraic roots, and you have a podcast for Catholics. I listen to it. I'm Catholic adjacent. I'm not a Catholic. I coined that term because I have a lot of Catholic friends, and I think Catholic social teaching is beautiful. So I enjoy listening to it. As a Protestant, you can learn a lot, but you specifically, have a call to action to anyone in the audience that's Catholic to listen to your podcast. So I don't know if you have a bit of information to share.
Yes, please follow us, called Beyond Rome. Not that we're over Rome, like we're over it, but that there are 24 Catholic churches. One of them is the Roman Catholic Church, but there are 23 others. And those 23 other Catholic churches, which are of equal dignity as the Roman Catholic Church, are They're Eastern. They're Eastern Catholics. I'm an Eastern Catholic living in a Roman Catholic Western world. And as John Paul II said to those Catholics who are listening to what I'm talking about, that the church has to breathe with both lungs, both her Eastern and Western lung. Well, that Eastern lung is her Hebraic roots, her Jewish roots, and also her Eastern Christian roots, because Christianity is an Eastern. It was born in Jerusalem, and then it spread to the East, and then later to Rome and to Europe and the West. So if you want to learn more about your spiritual heritage in the East, please listen to Beyond Rome.
Thank you so much, Simone. I'm excited for the next episode. And for our audience, the Philos Project is a nonprofit. So if you feel so led to support the work we're doing here, there will be a link in the description below. And as always, thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you next week. Thank you, Simone.
Thank you.